Have you ever waited for an apology that never came? Not because the person forgot, but because they simply couldn't say the words, "I'm sorry." It's not always about pride. Sometimes it's something much deeper. A wound, a fear, or a part of their identity they're trying to protect. Today, let's go inside the psychology of why some people can't apologize, and why it might not even be about you. Why some people can't apologize. Have you ever been in that strange, aching silence? The one that follows an argument, when the storm is over, but the air still feels heavy. You wait. You hope. You tell yourself, they'll say it. They have to say it. Just 2 words. I'm sorry. But hours turn into days, and the apology never comes. Not because they forgot. Not because they didn't know they hurt you. But because, for some reason, those words will not leave their mouth. And you're left wondering, why? Why is it so hard for some people to apologize? Is it pride? Is it arrogance? Or is it something much deeper? The truth is, an apology is never just an apology. To say "I'm sorry" is to lower the guard, to strip away the armor we use to protect our ego. For some people, that armor has been welded shut for years, maybe even since childhood. From a psychological perspective, there are layers beneath the refusal to apologize. The first is ego protection. Admitting fault means admitting imperfection. And for those whose self-worth is fragile, that can feel unbearable. It's not just about the event that happened. It's about what that event says about them. If they see mistakes as proof they are bad or inadequate, then an apology feels like self-destruction. There's also the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, "I did something bad." Shame says, "I am bad." When guilt is in play, an apology is easier. You admit the wrong, you take responsibility, you repair the relationship. But when shame takes over, the act of apologizing feels like confirming a deep, painful belief. There's something wrong with me. And so, to protect themselves from that inner collapse, they avoid the apology entirely. For many, the roots go back to childhood. Picture a child who grows up in a household where admitting mistakes leads to punishment, humiliation, or endless lectures. Over time, they learn a survival tactic: never admit fault. It's not that they lack empathy. It's that admitting they're wrong triggers the same fear they felt as a child, the fear of being shamed, rejected, or even abandoned. Now, as adults, they may not consciously realize it, but the emotional reflex is still there. Hide the mistake, defend yourself, change the subject, go silent. Anything but say, "I'm sorry." There's also fear. A very specific kind of fear. Fear of losing control in a relationship. Fear that if they admit fault once, you will bring up every past grievance. Fear that apologizing opens the door to being taken advantage of. And so they hold the line, convinced that silence will protect them, not realizing it's quietly eroding the connection. Cultural background can play a role too. In some cultures, apologizing is seen as weakness, a loss of dignity. In competitive environments, whether in business, politics, or even certain family dynamics, the one who admits fault is seen as the loser. If someone has been shaped by that mindset, they might feel that apologizing puts them at the bottom of a hierarchy they are desperate to stay on top of. But what happens in the space left by the missing apology? Relationships become like glass with a crack running through it. You can still see through it, still use it, but the damage is always there, ready to spread under the slightest pressure. Trust weakens. Resentment grows. Sometimes, the silence says more than words ever could, and not in a good way. For the person waiting, it's not just the absence of an apology. It's the feeling that their pain wasn't acknowledged, that their reality wasn't validated. And here's something even more difficult to accept. When someone can't apologize, it's often not about you at all. It's about their relationship with themselves. To apologize, you need to believe you can make a mistake and still be worthy of love. You need to believe that being wrong doesn't make you unlovable. If they don't have that belief, if their self-worth is conditional, brittle, then "I'm sorry" feels like an impossible sentence to say. So, what can you do if you're in this situation? The first step is to understand that your healing cannot depend entirely on those words. Waiting for an apology that will never come is like holding your breath underwater. Eventually, it's you who suffers. Sometimes, closure comes from inside, from recognizing the limits of the other person's emotional capacity. You can set boundaries. You can choose how much access they have to your heart. You can let go of the fantasy that they will suddenly transform and give you the apology you've been longing for. Of course, this doesn't mean excusing their behavior or pretending the hurt didn't happen. It means understanding that their silence says more about their inner wounds than about your worth. In fact, learning to live without their apology can be an act of freedom, a way to reclaim your peace instead of waiting for someone else to hand it to you. One story comes to mind. A woman I once knew had a falling out with her father in her early 20s. He said something deeply hurtful during an argument, something that cut into her sense of belonging. She waited for him to apologize, but it never came. At first, she thought he just needed time. Then she realized he would never say it, not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know how. He had grown up in a family where vulnerability was punished, where "I'm sorry" was replaced by a silent gesture. Fixing something broken, cooking a meal, or simply moving on as if nothing happened. For years, she carried that wound, until one day she decided to see his silence not as rejection, but as the limit of what he could give. It didn't erase the pain, but it released her from waiting. In the end, an apology is powerful, but understanding is even more powerful. We can wish for those words, and sometimes we may even receive them. But if we don't, we can still choose peace. Because while an apology might mend the bridge between two people, understanding can build a bridge back to yourself. And that might be the most important bridge of all. Sometimes the refusal to apologize doesn't come in complete silence. Instead, it comes dressed as something that looks like an apology, but isn't. Psychologists sometimes call these pseudo-apologies, but you've probably heard them in everyday life without realizing what they are. They sound like, "I'm sorry you feel that way," or "I'm sorry if you were offended." At first, the word sorry is there, but listen closer. The focus isn't on the action that caused harm, but on your reaction. It's a subtle shift that changes the meaning completely. These non-apologies can be even more frustrating than no apology at all, because they pretend to be resolution while keeping the blame away from the person who hurt you. "I'm sorry you feel that way" really means your feelings are the problem, not what I did. "I'm sorry if you were offended" suggests that your pain is hypothetical, as if you might just be imagining it. It's a way of avoiding accountability while giving the illusion of politeness. Then there's the conditional apology. "I'll apologize if you admit you were wrong too." This turns an apology into a negotiation, a bargaining chip, rather than a genuine act of repair. It's rooted in the idea that admitting fault must be perfectly balanced on both sides. Otherwise, one person loses too much. But real apologies aren't currency to be traded. They're gifts meant to repair trust. You might also encounter the overly vague apology. Mistakes were made. Made by who? By what? This kind of language creates distance between the action and the person responsible. It's as if the hurt happened by accident, without an agent, like the wind knocks something over. This detachment keeps the person's ego safe while leaving the injured party without the validation they need. If you pay attention, you'll start to see patterns in people who struggle, or outright refuse, to apologize. One sign is deflection. When confronted, they immediately bring up your past mistakes, shifting the focus away from the current situation. It's a tactic to avoid the discomfort of staying with the topic at hand. Another sign is minimizing. "It wasn't that big of a deal," or "you're overreacting." This not only dodges accountability, it also undermines your reality. And then there's stonewalling, shutting down the conversation completely, refusing to engage at all. This can be the most painful response because it leaves you alone with the wound, without even the chance to express your side. For someone who fears vulnerability, stonewalling feels safe. For the person on the receiving end, it feels like abandonment. The hardest truth is this: some people will never give you the apology you deserve. Not because you didn't matter, but because their emotional toolkit simply doesn't include that skill. If no one ever modeled a sincere apology for them, if their parents never said, "I'm sorry," when they were wrong, then they might not even know what one looks like. Their pride, their fear, their unresolved shame all become walls that are nearly impossible to climb. So, what do you do when you're faced with this reality? One approach is to adjust your expectations. Instead of waiting for words that may never come, look for other ways the person might be trying, clumsily, to make amends. Some people express remorse through actions rather than words, fixing what they broke, doing you a favor, or offering a small kindness after a conflict. It's not the same as a verbal apology, and it doesn't erase the hurt, but recognizing these gestures can help you see the humanity behind their silence. Another approach is to protect your emotional boundaries. If the lack of apology is part of a bigger pattern, a refusal to take responsibility for anything, you may need to decide how much space you want to give that person in your life. Sometimes the healthiest choice is creating distance, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. It's also worth considering the power of self-closure. This doesn't mean pretending you weren't hurt, or that the hurt doesn't matter. It means acknowledging the wound, feeling it fully, and then deciding that your peace isn't going to be held hostage by someone else's inability to own their actions. In a way, you give yourself the apology you wish they'd given you. You didn't deserve to be treated that way. What happened was wrong, and you have the right to heal from it. There's a quiet strength in letting go of the need for someone else's validation. Think of it like releasing a heavy rope in a tug of war. As long as you hold on, you're pulled into the struggle, waiting for the other side to loosen their grip. But once you let go, the tension disappears. You may not have won in the traditional sense, but you've freed yourself from the exhausting pull. One client I once spoke to told me about her younger brother. Growing up, he was quick to anger and slow to admit fault. As adults, their relationship was strained. One day, after a particularly hurtful argument, she decided to stop expecting him to apologize. It wasn't that she stopped caring, it was that she realized his inability to say, "I'm sorry," came from his own wounds, not from a lack of love. Instead of waiting, she focused on creating moments of connection that didn't rely on verbal apologies, sharing a meal, helping him with a project, sending a thoughtful message. Slowly, their relationship improved, not because he changed, but because she stopped holding him to a standard he couldn't meet. This isn't to say you should accept any behavior without consequence, but when you understand that the inability to apologize is often about the other person's limitations, you can choose how to respond in a way that protects your dignity and your peace. In the end, apologies are not just about two words. They're about acknowledgement, accountability, and repair. When those things are absent, it's natural to feel the loss deeply. But there's a paradox here. The less you depend on someone else to give you closure, the freer you become. You may never hear "I'm sorry" from them, but you can learn to live as if you had, by offering yourself the compassion they couldn't. Because the truth is, waiting for an apology that will never come is like standing at a locked door, hoping it will open if you just knock long enough. At some point, you realize the key is in your hand, and the door you can walk through leads back to yourself. There's a hidden belief that runs deep in some people's minds. To apologize is to lose power. You might not hear them say it out loud, but you can see it in the way they avoid those two simple words, as if speaking them would hand over the keys to their dignity. This belief doesn't appear overnight. It's built over years, sometimes decades, of social conditioning, personal wounds, and cultural narratives about strength and weakness. In competitive environments, whether in certain workplaces, families, or even romantic relationships, there's often an unspoken hierarchy. The person who admits fault drops down a rung, and the person who receives the apology rises a little higher. For someone who is deeply invested in maintaining control or influence, this drop in perceived status feels dangerous. It's as if apologizing is a surrender, not to the truth, but to the other person's authority. And so, they hold their ground. Sometimes this belief starts early. Imagine a child who grows up with siblings, constantly competing for attention or approval. If one admits fault, they might be teased, punished, or made to feel small. Over time, that child learns that being wrong equals being weak. They learn to win arguments not by honesty, but by endurance, by holding their stance until the other person gives up. By the time they're adults, apologizing feels less like a path to repair, and more like voluntarily stepping off the battlefield. Cultural narratives can amplify this mindset. In some societies, especially those with a strong emphasis on saving face, to apologize publicly is to invite shame. Leaders are taught to project certainty, not vulnerability. Parents are told they must always be right in front of their children to maintain authority. In these environments, an apology isn't a gesture of respect. It's a crack in the armor. And for those who've spent their lives building that armor, even a hairline fracture feels intolerable. There's also the psychological link between apology and submission in certain power dynamics. In relationships where one person feels perpetually on the defensive, Perhaps because they've been criticized or undermined for years, admitting fault can feel like confirming the other person's negative view of them. It's not just, "I was wrong this time." It's, "You were right about me all along." For a fragile self-image, that's too big a risk to take. Ironically, the people who resist apologizing to maintain power often end up losing a different kind of power, the quiet, lasting influence that comes from trust and respect. You can win an argument and still lose the relationship. You can protect your pride and still damage your credibility. Over time, those around you start to notice the pattern. They learn that you will fight to the last breath to avoid admitting fault, and that knowledge changes the way they trust you. The impact on relationships is subtle but corrosive. When one person refuses to apologize, the other often begins to doubt the fairness of the connection. Resentments accumulate like small stones in a jar, and eventually, the weight becomes too much. Conversations become guarded. Conflicts go unresolved, not because the problems are too big, but because the act of repair, the apology, is missing. And yet, the irony is that in healthy relationships, an apology doesn't diminish power, it strengthens it. When a leader admits a mistake, people often respect them more, not less. When a parent apologizes to a child, it models humility and emotional maturity, teaching the child that love is not dependent on perfection. In friendships and romantic partnerships, a sincere apology can deepen intimacy, creating a sense of safety where both people can be human without fear. But to reach that understanding, someone has to let go of the old belief that vulnerability equals weakness, and for many, that's the hardest part. Vulnerability means stepping into uncertainty, not knowing exactly how the other person will respond. If someone has lived their whole life guarding against judgment, that leap can feel impossible. I once spoke to a man who had been married for over 30 years and admitted he had never once apologized to his wife. Not because he had never made mistakes, he knew he had, but because in his mind, apologizing would put him under her. When asked what he feared most, he said, "If I say I'm wrong, she'll never see me the same way." The heartbreaking part was, his wife didn't need him to be flawless. She just needed to feel that he valued her feelings enough to acknowledge when he hurt her. Over time, his silence didn't make him seem stronger in her eyes. It made him seem unreachable. Breaking that pattern requires a shift in perspective, seeing an apology not as a loss of ground, but as an investment in connection. It means redefining strength, not as the ability to never bend, but as the ability to bend without breaking. True power in relationships doesn't come from always being right. It comes from creating an environment where both people can be wrong, learn, and grow without fear. And perhaps that's the lesson for those of us on the receiving end too. When someone can't apologize, it's not just stubbornness, it's a belief system. We can't dismantle it for them, but we can decide how we'll respond to it. We can choose to stop playing the game where apologies are trophies and start focusing on the health of the connection itself. Because at the end of the day, the most enduring kind of power is not the power to win every argument, but the power to repair, to rebuild the bridge after the storm, so that both people can walk across it again. When you grow up in a household where apologies are rare or non-existent, you learn certain unspoken rules about how relationships work. These lessons aren't taught directly. They seep into you through the silences, through the way conflicts begin and end without closure, through the way pain is brushed aside in favor of pretending everything is fine. Over time, these patterns can shape not only how you see others, but how you see yourself. In families where no one apologizes, conflicts often follow a predictable cycle. Someone says or does something hurtful. Emotions flare. Then, instead of resolution, there's avoidance. Maybe the person who caused the hurt starts acting as if nothing happened, making small talk at dinner, turning on the TV, offering you a snack. To a child, this sends a very specific message. We don't talk about pain here, we just move on. The problem is, you don't move on, you carry it with you. Growing up this way teaches you that your feelings aren't important enough to be acknowledged, that if you're hurt, it's better to swallow it than to expect repair. And perhaps most damaging, it teaches you that love can exist without accountability, that people can care about you without ever admitting when they've wronged you. When children internalize these lessons, they often carry them into adulthood in one of two ways. Some repeat the pattern. They too avoid apologizing because they've never seen it modeled as something normal or safe. Others swing to the opposite extreme. They apologize excessively, sometimes even for things that aren't their fault, because they're desperate to maintain connection and afraid of the silent void they knew as children. Either way, the absence of real apologies leaves scars. It can make conflict feel dangerous because, in your experience, conflict never leads to healing, only to distance. So you might avoid difficult conversations entirely, letting resentment fester instead of risking the coldness that follows. Or, if you do engage, you might fight to win rather than to understand, because you've learned that reconciliation isn't really on the table. This conditioning also affects how you love. If you grew up without hearing, "I'm sorry," you might struggle to trust that hurt can be repaired. You may feel safest with people who, like your family, avoid confrontation, even if that means the relationship lacks depth. Or you may find yourself drawn to partners who are emotionally unavailable, because their inability to apologize feels strangely familiar. It's not that you consciously want the pain, it's that your nervous system recognizes the pattern and mistakes it for normal. And then there's forgiveness. True forgiveness requires acknowledgement, a recognition of the harm done. Without that acknowledgement, forgiveness can feel incomplete, like trying to close a door that won't latch. Some people in this situation convince themselves they've forgiven, but the wound still aches years later. Others become so guarded that they stop offering second chances altogether because they don't trust that the other person will ever own their part in the hurt. The absence of apologies in childhood also teaches a distorted version of strength. You might grow up believing that being strong means never admitting fault, never showing vulnerability, never letting someone else see you wrong. But real strength is the opposite. It's the ability to face your mistakes without collapsing under the weight of shame. Without seeing that modeled, it's easy to confuse rigidity with resilience. I once spoke with a woman in her 40s who had never, in her entire life, heard her father apologize. Not to her, not to anyone. When she was a teenager, there was a day he missed an important event she had invited him to. She waited for him to say something, to acknowledge the hurt. Instead, the next time they saw each other, he handed her a new book and said, "I thought you'd like this." It was his way of making amends without words, but for her, it felt incomplete. She learned to accept gifts in place of accountability, but deep down, she craved the simple dignity of hearing, "I'm sorry I let you down." By the time she had children of her own, she realized how powerful those words could be. One evening, after snapping at her son for something minor, she paused, took a breath, and said, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have spoken to you that way." Her son's face softened, the tension dissolved, and in that moment, she understood what she had missed all those years. That an apology doesn't just repair the moment, it teaches the other person they matter enough to be made whole. The good news is that patterns can be broken. Growing up without apologies doesn't doom you to repeat the cycle. It does, however, require conscious effort to unlearn what you've been taught. You have to practice giving the kind of apology you never received, specific, accountable, and sincere. You have to teach yourself that saying, "I'm sorry," doesn't erase your worth, but affirms your humanity. It also means surrounding yourself with people who model healthy repair. This might feel uncomfortable at first, unsettling even, because it's unfamiliar. But over time, it retrains your understanding of what relationships can be. You learn that it's possible to disagree, to hurt each other, and still come back together stronger. That the end of an argument doesn't have to be silence, it can be connection. Breaking free from a no-apology upbringing is, in many ways, an act of reparenting yourself. You give yourself what your younger self needed: validation, acknowledgement, and the reassurance that mistakes don't make you unlovable. And when you do that, you not only heal old wounds, you prevent them from being passed down to the next generation. Because here's the truth: apologies are not just about admitting fault. They're about affirming the bond between people, saying, "You matter enough to me that I will step down from my pride and stand with you in this moment." And that is the kind of strength that no silence can match. If you grew up in a world where apologies were absent, learning to apologize as an adult can feel awkward, even risky. It's like speaking a language you were never taught. Every word feels uncertain on your tongue. But the good news is, this is a skill you can learn. And more importantly, it's one that can transform not only your relationships, but also your own sense of self. The first step is understanding what a real apology is, and what it isn't. A real apology is specific. It names the action and acknowledges its impact. "I'm sorry I interrupted you in the meeting. It made you feel unheard." That's different from the vague, "Sorry if I offended you," which shifts responsibility away from you. In healthy apologies, you take ownership without diluting the truth. The second step is removing the word but. I'm sorry, but I was under a lot of stress isn't an apology. It's an explanation that competes with the apology. You can give context later, but first, let the other person feel seen without conditions. The moment you add but, you're no longer standing with them in the hurt. You're stepping away to defend yourself. Third, acknowledge the emotional reality, not just the facts. Many people skip this because they think apologizing is about the event. But more often than not, it's about the feeling. Saying, "I'm sorry I forgot to call you back," is fine. But saying, "I'm sorry I forgot to call you back. I realize it made you feel unimportant, and that's not how I want you to feel," reaches the heart of the wound. Fourth, separate guilt from identity. One reason people avoid apologizing is because they equate, "I did something wrong," with, "I am a bad person." Remind yourself, actions can be wrong without erasing your worth. Admitting a mistake is not self-destruction, it's self-awareness. In fact, it can deepen respect from others because they see you as someone who values truth over ego. Fifth, practice in low-stakes situations. If apologizing feels like standing on a cliff edge, start small. Apologize when you bump into someone, when you misplace an item, when you forget a minor detail. Get comfortable with the rhythm of taking responsibility. Over time, it becomes easier to apply in deeper, more vulnerable situations. I once knew a man named David who had never, in 40 years, apologized to anyone. In his family, mistakes were ignored, not addressed. When he married, arguments with his wife would end with long silences and tension that could stretch for days. One day, after raising his voice in frustration, he caught the look on her face. Not anger, but exhaustion. For the first time, he decided to try something different. He said, "I'm sorry I spoke to you like that. You didn't deserve it." The words felt heavy, almost foreign, but something shifted in the room. She softened. The wall between them cracked just enough for connection to flow again. From then on, he made it a practice, not just in big conflicts, but in small moments too. Over time, apologizing became less of a mountain to climb and more of a bridge he knew how to build. Learning to apologize also means listening without defense. Often, we fear the apology will open a floodgate of complaints. But in truth, most people just want to feel heard. When you can listen fully, without preparing your counterargument, the apology becomes part of a larger act of respect. If you're on the other side, dealing with someone who can't apologize, there's another kind of skill to learn, releasing your dependence on those words for your healing. Sometimes you have to give yourself the closure they can't provide. That might mean writing down the apology you wish they'd say, and then speaking it aloud to yourself. It might mean telling a trusted friend what happened, so your experience is witnessed and validated. It might mean deciding that your peace is too important to let someone else's limitations control it. Breaking the cycle is hard, but it's worth it. Every sincere apology you give plants a different seed, one that grows into trust, safety, and deeper connection. If you have children, you show them that love is strong enough to admit fault. If you have friends or a partner, you show them that your bond matters more than your pride. And if you have yourself, you show that you are capable of change, of growth, of stepping out of the shadow of the past. Because in the end, apologies are not about losing power. They are about choosing connection over control, humility over ego, truth over the illusion of perfection. They say, "I care more about us than about being right." And in a world where so many people guard their pride like a fortress, that choice is radical. So maybe the question isn't, why can't some people apologize? Maybe the better question is, what kind of person do I want to be? You can choose to be the one who breaks the pattern, who teaches by example that admitting you're wrong is not the end of your dignity. It's the beginning of your authenticity. And for those who still can't say the words, remember, their silence is not your measure. Their inability to apologize is not a verdict on your worth. You can forgive without hearing "I'm sorry." You can heal without their permission. And you can walk forward with the quiet confidence of someone who knows that the strongest thing you can ever do is to tell the truth, even when it costs you your pride. Because at the heart of every real apology is love. And love, in its truest form, has never been afraid to bow its head and say, "I was wrong, I'm sorry."